In the first episode of the series, we spoke about the variety and people's reactions to the pandemic. We also mentioned that this variety is largely due to differences in personality. The risk type compass is a psychometric measure of risk personality which places everybody into one of 8 risk types. Each person's position on the compass is related to the way they perceive, process, and react to risk, and how that influences their decision making. Those who are closer together on the compass with a similar position will react in similar ways, while those further away from one another will react in increasingly different ways. Our aim at this point is to review what we've been put through during COVID-19, but from the perspective of the psychology of individuals. It is essential to recognise the reality of extreme variation in risk dispositions, and then as a consequence of that, the differences in the lived experience of different risk types. Just as sheep have become the metaphor for sameness, humanity is the epitome of diverse individuality. You cannot herd people. So in this episode, we're going to look at 2 polar opposite risk types, drawing a line across the diameter of the compass from about 10 minutes to the hour to about 20 minutes past the hour, and examining how we would expect various people at different points across that line to experience the risk and uncertainties of a pandemic, how they think and how they feel. The pair of risk types at opposite ends of this line are the composed and the intense risk type. We will also be looking at some of the findings from our own recent research that explores the differences in how different risk types reacted to COVID-19. This scale is one of the core measures underpinning the risk type compass. Decision making involves both emotion and cognition, and this is the risk type compass scale that calibrates the measure of emotion. Our 21st century emotions are highly evolved versions of neurological systems, systems that themselves have origins in the perceptual and responsive capabilities of the most primitive life forms. The survival of every species has always relied on the capacity to sense and respond effectively to risk and to those warnings. The most prominent feature within our current emotional repertoire is fear, and the scale that we're discussing today calibrates risk dispositions from an overwhelming fearfulness at one end, 3 levels of anxiety, apprehension, and concern, through to increasing levels of optimism and confidence, calmness at the other end, right the way through to a fearless imperturbability. Now, the lived experience of COVID-19 for these 2 polar opposite risk types could hardly be more different in terms of the emotions aroused in relation to personal safety or security or loss. So, starting at the extreme intense end of the scale, within this group are people that will have been deeply, deeply troubled, horrified, and made desperate by the idea that there's this global killer virus and that there's an invisible menace floating in the very air we breathe, perpetuated by coughs and sneezes and exhalings of people around us, and leaving a trail of just death and suffering in its wake. And particularly so in those that are elderly or already vulnerable for some reason, these people will have needed little encouragement to take things seriously, very seriously. They will have been terrified by the idea that simply being in the wrong place at the wrong moment of time, they too could be smitten, and suddenly everything is potentially contaminated. Even in their own homes, they may not be safe. Any visitor or item delivered to their door could bring the dreaded virus with it, and they may even have already been infected. So every other person from this point of view must be regarded with fear and suspicion of toxicity, whatever the social distance is suggested by authorities as necessary to avoid infection. The extreme intense risk type would consider as inadequate, not because of any sort of form of objective evidence, but because their gut reaction and their fear-driven sensations would be frantically signalling, waving a big red flag, avoid it at all costs. If they ventured out of their homes, it would have been out of necessity, and they would put as much distance between themselves and others as they possibly could. All of their anxieties, which would already be skyrocketing, would have been continually further inflamed by all of the changing patterns and regulations and sort of the stop-go nature of lockdown measures. that masks are pointless and masks are essential, from the we're all in this together and we're almost there to the oops, no, we're not. There's the issue of which locations are acceptable here but not there, and this kind of place is okay, and then actually no, that's now banned as well. Juggling all of that, plus also the social contact permutations, family vis-a-vis neighbours, friends and colleagues, or just other people out and about in public. This creates a dystopian nightmare, a labyrinth of ever-changing boundaries and guidelines. Then, at last, as the end is in sight, nope, sorry, not till we have a vaccine. To an extreme intense risk type, by any definition, this is like some form of torture. There is no need for the nudge club here to scare people with lurid exaggerations, and our research found exactly this. The intense risk types found the lack of detail provided around the pandemic to be far more distressing than others. So as policy, government advice and regulations are changing, as the data on positive test results are sort of increasing, and you compound that with the death rates and the added complexity of T cells and antibodies and the mutations that are coming through, there's always something to tweak the nerves that are already strained to breaking point. But within Team Homo sapiens, it would seem that the unique contribution of the intense risk type has been to keep all of us safe by alerting us to every sign of potential risk, every danger or threat to personal security. And that's a tough assignment, to be the caged canary in the coal mine. Their delicately and sensitively calibrated risk antennae are fine-tuned to support the survival of the species. They are precision surveillance instruments, and they're essential for the performance in this protective role. But these antennae have been brutally assaulted and blasted by an avalanche of just off-the-scale screaming pitch alarm signals. It's like ripping through the tranquility by setting off a box of fireworks in a library on a Sunday. Their risk dispositions give them very little respite at the best of times, and what they have been coping through must come close to being the worst of times. Now, that's a picture at the outer edge of the risk type compass within the intense risk type segment. Numbers at this outer edge are fairly small, which is a fortunate thing in these circumstances, but there's no better example of the pure lunacy of treating humanity as if they were all of one kind, and herding, deliberately frightening people in order to get them to comply. While pushing the intense risk type to their limits and beyond, this one-size-fits-all approach to regulation has an entirely different impact on the composed risk type, their polar opposite. So, step by step then, as we move in from the outer edge of the compass, fears become increasingly diluted and the nerves less strained, apprehensions less fraught, and pessimism as well less extreme. Moving on beyond that neutral territory at the axis of the compass and towards the opposite outer edge, we encounter the composed risk types. Here, the atmosphere could hardly be more different. So different at the extreme end that neither of these risk types will find the other credible in any way. Each will be an enigma as far as the other is concerned. Amongst all of the hype and panic and confusion that's accompanied the sudden appearance of COVID-19, emblazoned in banner headlines and being the top feature in daily news for, month after month, and the initial presumption of massive fatality that echoed around the world, in all of this furore, the composed risk type remained calm, patient, and detached. It's not that they're unconcerned by the events, but they're just not experiencing that emotional turmoil. In fact, by contrast, they remain optimistic about the months ahead, and they trust that things will turn out all right in the end. Nobody could have been entirely impervious to the media's incitement of public distress, sort of encouraging belief in the worst possible interpretation of events, but skeptical by nature, but alert to emerging facts and figures, the composed risk type antennae are just scanning the airwaves in search of coherence, explanations, and evidence. They reserve their judgment and they wait for the hysteria to settle down. This scenario will not be their first experience of a mass display of frenzy and consternation. Their natural dispositions are always more likely to make them a somewhat detached observer of, rather than participant in, that frenzy. In their daily lives at home and in work, many parallels recur on a daily basis, with accidents or setbacks that occur cranking up sort of these spikes of high level apprehension or anxiety. They're used to these waves and peaks of the reaction in their more emotionally sensitive family members and work colleagues. Even to scale that up to crowds and populations, these waves that erupt, slowly peak and subside. They'll also be used to others coming to them, the person that's singled out by their calmness and their composure, others that may look to them for reassurance or to take charge and somehow restore the peace, because when panic reigns, they have the composure to take charge of the situation, to sort out the life belts, or to coax others into safety. Colleagues may turn to them, seeking that fearless heroic action. But the composed risk type, is important to say, they're not quite the embodiment of the intrepid hero. Sure, their anxiety is dialed down, closer to zero, but composure on its own doesn't equate with sensational heroism. However, what it does do is save them from being sucked into the mayhem and chaos. And within that calmness, they're more likely to see a way out than those experiencing the same events more intensely. Now, these descriptions of risk types here, they're not exaggeration, but they do focus on the extremes between which most people will fall. All the risk types are prevalent within the population, and so they need to be able to work together. And conflict will arise because team members and colleagues may well see the world very differently. But with insight, those conflicts can be turned into collaboration because the risk types do complement each other. The development of self-awareness along with mutual respect will achieve risk-aware decision-making, and teams that maximize diverse risk perspectives avoid groupthink and perform at their best. So don't miss the next exciting installment of the For Pandemic series. In the next episode, we're going to be looking at the prudent and carefree risk types. But if you can't wait until then to find out more about the risk type compass, then please do get in touch. We are always happy to talk about all things risk type.